The Honourable Dr. Brian Walker.
Thank you, Acting President. I have promised I'll just have a few words here because it's difficult to follow in the likes of my esteemed colleagues here, especially Honourable Dr. Brad Pettit, who gave a very convincing discussion just now, a contribution which I think merits close attention. And I note his supplementary notice paper stands to be debated yet. Now, I'm probably going to give more of a philosophical contribution here because I think, though, the points have been made. And one is that I'm missing from the discussion so far is a question of balance. This has here been all about the tenants and what needs to be done to help the tenants secure their property, and I'm quite on board with that. In fact, I was saying at the briefing that most of this I can quite agree with. That's a very sensible legislation. But as the Honourable Brad Pettit said, there are things which might be missing, which could be helpful if that was added to the mix. But the balance I'm talking about here is kind of the difference between the landlord and the tenant. Because you see, if we're talking about buying a house, which you're then going to rent out as an investment property, that's a significant cost. Now, we could talk for a long time about the tax benefits of having an investment property and whether it's right to have negative gearing or not. That's another discussion altogether. The point is that for the landlord, who has made that decision that they're going to invest quite heavily in a new property, they're going to want to have some kind of assurance that their investment is not going to be destroyed. On the other hand, the tenant is going to want to have a property which is actually worth living in. Now, I'm thinking back to a patient of mine, a patient's mother, 90-odd-year-old, and her daughter, 60s. And they were living on a lovely property. There was 2 horses there. That was and it was family friends who had actually said, yes, you can live here. Don't worry, this is your home for life. You're all good. Now, November of last year, they came into my clinic in tears, actually, because they'd been told to get out before Christmas. So a 93-year-old in considerable pain and a daughter who's struggling to manage with quite significant animal concerns in a remote and rural, well, not remote, but rural area. And they're told to leave in 60 days before Christmas. And I challenge anyone to feel well at that news. And the next thing that happened was, your family, your friends, we love you, you love us. What's going on here? We need to move into the house, which wasn't actually true, I believe, but we need to move in. You've got to get out before Christmas. And the next thing that happens, of course, it goes to the lawyer. Now, if you have got trouble meeting the rent in the first place, then you've got to pay lawyer fees to look for your rights. We're talking here about severe financial imposition on people, as well as the quite supreme mental health struggles to deal with this. Is that fair? Is that right? I think no one would agree that that's a right thing to do, but it happens. And as has been pointed out already, most landlords will do their best to support their tenants. But that's not everybody. On the other hand, if you are going to make a significant investment and then you have no rights with that investment because they've all belonged to the tenant as one possible risk, then who is actually going to want to volunteer their property for tenancy when they could be earning a whole lot more on their investment by doing Airbnb? It makes a financial sense to do that, does it not? I have invested in my property, I want the most return for that property. So there's a problem here in, are we going to then dictate to people how they make a return on their investment? And the answer quite clearly is yes. Making property a less interesting investment. Now, I've been to a number of property courses and seen how people will look at this as a way of securing their futures, because they are well aware that the employment market here is not that great either. And that if they're going to work their backsides off for not a great salary, they're not going FIFO and earning very healthy amounts, they're going to have to find a way of financing their retirement. Because their stocks have gone down, there was a financial crash, they're seeing chaos all about them, they're looking at the possibility of Trump winning again and the economy going down the tubes. And of course they're going to want to find some way of ensuring that they've got something to put food on the table. And this is one method of doing that. And here we have the thought of government impositions which say you can't do this and you can't do that. So someone comes into your property and basically that's it, which is the impression that the landlords might well have if they didn't take a deeper look at the legislation. So we have to find a balance between the rights and responsibilities of both the landlords and the tenants. And I do think this legislation does that. I do think it does. I was visiting that wonderful organisation in Fremantle, St Pat's, and looked at the fantastic job they're doing. And this brought me into contact, of course, in more detail with the wide variety of issues regarding homelessness and finding homes for those who have been dispossessed. How do you manage with the social issues, the psychosocial issues? How do you cope with a group of people who are homeless or heading towards homelessness, who simply don't have the wherewithal, either physically or mentally or financially, to manage for themselves? Is it our responsibility to look after them? The answer is, colleagues, yes, it is, to help those who are the weakest. But should it then mean that we give the whip hand to those who are sitting back and doing nothing? We might say, I'll disagree with that contention, but those who are unable to provide are now sitting out and we're going to give them housing, and what are they going to do with that? Well, they're going to move into the house perhaps and not treat it as well as you or I might. And a landlord faced with that obligation is going to find, why would I want to expose my hard-earned and valuable property to people who don't respect it? Because generally, when you own something, you respect it more than if you actually take someone else's property. This is the nature of humanity. So we have to question here, what do we do with the tenant who is not prepared to look after the property? I recall, again, I'm talking from personal experience, my patients, I see a broad spread of what goes on in the community. Mental health issues, of course, underlying all this, putting holes in the wall, kicking doors down, setting fire to things. That is not good for a house. And if you own that house, but you're renting it out to someone who is doing that, you're not going to be very happy. There are laws then we could look at, well, how do we protect the landlord from people who are actually causing damage? Maybe the hoarders who are actually putting junk up to the eaves of the house in the backyard and making it a dismal place for everybody else, reducing the property values of the neighbouring properties, so when they try to sell, their price has gone down. There's a lovely example we got from, I think it was in the US, where they discovered if you allowed in a housing estate, if you allowed one window to remain broken, other windows got broken as well. Because the pattern had been set. No one looked after it. No one cared. And as a result of that, the neighbouring properties all suffered from this, the downgrading, and then the property area, which might have been quite pleasant or salubrious, then gradually degenerated into something which was actually more slum-like. And so landlords would be desperate to avoid that situation, to care for their properties. So that's just the basic situation. How do we deal with this? And again, this bill goes, I think, a long way to giving rights to the tenant, but also specifying what needs to happen when this is not done. I was looking through the bill then, and I counted, well, I didn't count, my software counted, the word commissioner coming 143 times in the bill. And I looked for a definition of the word commissioner, and I couldn't find one. So I thought, okay, fine. It's maybe in the committee of the whole, we might find out what is a commissioner, who is a commissioner, and what are, tell me more about that. Apparently, it's something to do with the government. There's a government body of some sort. But it hasn't been defined, at least not that I could find in my reading. It's a fairly hefty tome in the Blue Bill. So, what we're looking for here, I think, is to find some measure of moving forward in a crisis, because we are actually, as has been mentioned before, we are in a housing crisis. And it's not just those who are homeless, those who are barely keeping their home together. Now, if we look at the rental market, those who are in a home and they're paying a rent, and again, I've got personal experience from patients of mine who have gone to the bank because they want to buy their own property and look after it. And the cost of the mortgage, they've done the calculations, the cost of the mortgage is less than the rent they're paying, and the bank says, no, you can't afford it. So we're actually shutting people out of owning their own property because of a perception of the risks to the bank, but they're actually paying more, in fact, quite a substantial sum more than the actual rent. And when we come to legislation, I think something has to be done about this, of making housing more affordable for people. And it's not just a matter of building more houses, but when I come to building more houses, I would then say, let's go at one of the major problems I see in our society, and I will mention this again and again in this House in this coming year, and that is status quo thinking, which keeps us firmly stuck in the past. Now, the status quo thinking is what allows us in Indigenous communities up in the Kimberley to build 3x2 buildings which are totally unsuited for the life up there. We then ask about what's the insulation like, as we mentioned earlier, and how much heating do we have to put in a house in winter, or how much cooling to a house in summer. And then we ask ourselves, why don't we make more use? You're going to criticize me if I don't say this. Why don't we make more use of hemp houses which don't require heating in winter or cooling in summer? I do my best, Leader of the House. But it's also true, if we were to add onto that the solar heating or the solar power, if we were to then consider that perhaps we ought not to look at long-term deep sewage, but turning a village collection of sewage into an electricity generating point, the ethanol or methanol burners, the biodigesters, which is actually third world technology if you build it like that in China, but is actually a first world technology which can be created here. And I spoke about this when I was living in Kananopan. Could we not do this with a new area there? Yes, we could, but no, we're not going to. We're going to do it the old-fashioned way. So the resources that we have and could employ to reduce the costs and enhance the environment are not actually being made use of. We could use hemp, of course, for the very safe and very effective insulating bats. We could even use, if you like, the hemp fabrics and the hemp materials to turn sunlight into electricity. So imagine a hemp-based roof which could do that. How would we help those who are less well off if they didn't have to heat or cool their house and if the electricity was solar generated to a large extent? Would that be of any interest to a community which is crying out for help and new thinking? The status quo thinking that we are currently shackling ourselves with is actually leaving us in the past. We do not deserve to be there. And if we then look at the broader picture, of course, with the housing, it's not just the cost of the rent and all the utilities which go with that, but also the cost of living, of the groceries which we need to fill the house to feed ourselves under that roof, which also leads then to the food insufficiency, and then children going to school starving, who are then unable to actually learn, who then go into the workforce without having made use of their abilities to then become low-wage earning employees, who then continue that cycle of being unable to afford a home. So we're seeing a circle here of worsening of the housing situation because we're not thinking far enough ahead to actually deal with these problems in advance. Now, there's no criticism of government here for this, because this is actually quite new thinking. Because, as I'm saying, we're actually living with the old thinking present. So how can we possibly think of these new innovative technologies if we haven't been educated on them and to make use of them? Because while it's not going to work right now, I would be asking the government to consider, and there's both sides of the House, because at some time you are going to be back in power as well, maybe next century. But what we're needing here is a new thinking on all sides of the House to allow us to make the best use of the resources we have, such that we can support those who are less well off in every aspect of society, housing being a very important part of that. And with this brief diatribe, I'll close my words.